Okay, so last I checked, it was, March, and now it's June, and I have no idea how it became June. I don't know where I've been for the last 3 months. I don't know why I don't remember any of this. And I'm sure you're all very curious as to where I've been, but unfortunately I've got no idea. So, I this isn't my hat. They Last time they used these was World War One, and where the hell have I been?
Just glue some gears on it and call it steampunk. That's the trendy fashion nowadays. A copper painted chunk of some 1980s junk will fetch a pretty penny on eBay.
I decided to go ahead and talk about steampunk because I have had a couple of people not so much ask me as misunderstand what it is. So, I'm going to take this opportunity to enlighten people. So, before we go back to steampunk, we actually have to talk about cyberpunk first, which I will explain to the uninitiated. But cyberpunk was actually a reaction to classical science fiction. For a very long time, classical science fiction had this assumption that the future was going to be awesome. Everything was going to be great. Sort of, classical Star Trek, where you have, no war, everything's fine, nobody's hungry, we have great medical technology, and everybody lives a life of ease. Cyberpunk, which became very popular in the 80s and especially in the 90s, but people were writing about that before then, obviously, was sort of a rejection of that and saying that the future is going to suck, and the future is most likely going to be dominated by large corporations, and there's going to be a lot of urban poor. There's going to be a large gap between the rich and the poor, an increasing gap between the haves and the haves not, if you will. And technology is going to increasingly replace our humanity. In a sense, that's really what defines cyberpunk from classical science fiction. In classical science fiction, technology is our friend, and it aids us, and it creates us better as humanity, as humans, while in cyberpunk, technology rapidly replaces our humanity and we become less human because of it. And if you want some examples, a couple good ones, there's Feed, which is a newer novel, but it's very much in the cyberpunk genre, and definitely very enjoyable. And then another one, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. This is one of the sort of textbook examples, and this is actually the book that was the inspiration for Blade Runner. So, and Blade Runner, again, is very much in the cyberpunk vein. So if you're familiar with Blade Runner, that's basically what I'm talking about with cyberpunk. So eventually, authors began writing in reaction to cyberpunk, the steampunk genre, because steampunk was originally a reaction to cyberpunk. And basically the statement that although we have technology, it is going to make tomorrow better. And really that's what steampunk was originally all about, was tapping into this spirit, especially of the late 1800s, the late 19th century, with Jules Verne and H.G. Wells and all this really early prototypical science fiction, this belief that technology will make the future better and the future will be this glorious thing because of all the technological marvels, and we won't have to work because of technology. Which, again, is a lot of science fiction. Technology will help us supersede all of the common drudgery of day-to-day life. But it's tapping into that late 19th century aesthetic. It uses the aesthetics, it uses the technology, it uses the fashions, and steampunk has grown out of this sort of nostalgia for the past. And to an extent, steampunk has grown to be very complex beyond just a ideological rejection of cyberpunk. And it runs the entire spectrum. I mean, you go from the deconstruction, the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which is really a deconstruction of the Victorian era and Victorian literature, and you see all of these incredibly flawed people as they sort of react to a world that is changing. So, the future isn't going to be great because there are problems. But at the same time, you also have, the Girl Genius series by the Foglios, which, of course, is one of my favorites. And the Girl Genius series really captures the fun and excitement of bygone eras. It's about, adventure, mad science, and romance. It really is sort of the classical steampunk in that regard because it's this tapping into the past and nostalgia for the past and having fun with it. And then, some people do it just because it looks cool. Like in Rise of Legends, really, the Vinci, they have the airships, they have the steam powered tanks, they have all this other crazy gears and stuff, and it looks cool. And some people are into steampunk just because it looks cool. And to that extent, that's where it sort of breaks down because some people start to think that you just have to glue gears on it for it to be steampunk. And I have to agree there's a little bit more to that because really steampunk is tapping into the late 1800s, the high Victorian era, and trying to capture that sense of the past and sort of that hope of the future. Even though there are deconstructions, it's still sort of tapping into that aesthetic, at least on a superficial level, if nothing else. And so just gluing some gears onto something doesn't necessarily make it steampunk. You kind of have to go beyond that and tap into the Victorian aesthetic as well. And then, as an outgrowth from steampunk, you also have dieselpunk, which basically you take the technology and you move it forward another 40 years up to the 1930s, 1940s, and instead of being steam powered, you use the diesel engine has appeared, but it's still tapping into sort of that nostalgia for the past, specifically the pulp adventures of the 1930s and the 1940s. And if you're a long-time reader of my reviews, you know I love pulp. Pulp is fun for me because it doesn't hold back. It's willing to have fun and be awesome and just be utterly ridiculous. And that's really what I enjoy. At the end of the day, I like a good pulp adventure. And just sort of as an example, you have the Indiana Jones series, which actually is an homage to the original pulp adventures of the 1930s and 40s that George Lucas and Steven Spielberg grew up, remembering fondly. So it's even though Indiana Jones predates Dieselpunk as a sort of definition, it really defines the genre in some respects. And you also have other stuff like Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow, which a lot of people don't like, and I can see why you don't like it, but I still enjoy it because it's fun. For me, it's capturing that fun of the pulp adventures, and even then, you have stuff it's not really fun, but it still uses the same aesthetic, like the Rust series, which is very. This series has been very serious so far, from what I've read, but it still taps into the dieselpunk aesthetic. So again, dieselpunk, although it's tapping into the fun of the pulp adventures, it's also using the aesthetic of the 1930s and the 1940s to tell, different stories. So obviously genres get a lot more complex, but there are certain definitions as well, because not everything is dieselpunk. There are certain aesthetic requirements, and not everything is steampunk, because again, there are certain requirements. So to an extent, really, it's just the aesthetic requirements anymore which define something as that, but there's a deeper sort of history to these genres as well. Hopefully, I've helped enlighten you a little bit about the steampunk and dieselpunk genres. I know I went over this very quickly, and, it's a very complex issue, and we could spend hours talking about this, but, go out there. If this sounds interesting, if you have that same sort of nostalgia for the past, by all means, go out there, find works that you enjoy, read it, learn about it, and, tell me if you find anything interesting, because I'm always on the lookout for cool things. So, keep reading books. If you have any questions or any topics that you want me to specifically talk about, let me know. And in the meantime, I'm going to be trying to figure out where my 3 months went.
Steampunk refers to a type of science fiction about alternate pasts, not future prediction. Often set in Victorian Britain, but the history of technology has been rewritten. So put a bit of thought into your designs. Use leather and brass, 19th century lines. Retrofuturistic is a good explanation. Blend antique reality with imagination. But calling things steampunk to try to sound cool makes you look like a bloody fool. Just glue some gears on it and call it steampunk. That's the trendy fashion nowadays.
There hasn't been a change in the timeline, but there's a fluctuation in the vortex. But by definition, if there's a fluctuation in the vortex, that means the timeline has been changed. So either I don't remember the change, or there's something else afoot here. And in either case, it means there's something which is about to go down. And I don't know what it is.